What's going on, guys? Welcome back into the channel. Today we are actually going to discuss realistic position changes in Madden 20 and why knowing realistic position changes will make your life easier in the game. This is a topic that might not be for everybody because, you might already know realistic position changes and things like that. And so you don't have to watch this if you're a subscriber and you're experienced in these areas. But this is for some people that are less experienced in the game and less experienced with position changes and knowing the requirements at each position and being able to change players from one position to another to work to your advantage. And so that's kind of what I want to focus on today, is some of the newer players that might not have experience changing players from one position to another, and just giving some examples and breaking down each position change that you can do that would be realistic, that could help you out in your game. Because as you guys might see in my franchises, you guys might realize that I move players around from position to position all the time. You'll see me move offensive linemen from one offensive line position to another. You'll see me move my D linemen around. You might see me move linebackers to D end or D ends to linebacker. You might see me move some cornerbacks to safety or some safeties down to cornerback. And this happens in pretty much all of my franchises, because once you start to know what the position requirements are at each position, then you'll be able to realize, well, some of these guys can play multiple different positions, and it can be really valuable to you if you have players on your team that can play multiple positions. This is even more evident whenever you see some of the new hybrid type of players that are coming out on defense from the most recent draft classes. If you look at a guy like Jabril Peppers, who can play safety, linebacker, pass rusher, running back, they can play multiple different positions. But you aren't able to necessarily utilize all those positions just based on the depth chart and the way players are, and so sometimes you have to move them back and forth between positions. So what I want to do, just to show you my first example of how I've moved players around from position to help my team out, is if you guys remember back in the day, whenever I've given you some of the updates on the Bills franchise here, I moved quite a few people around from position to position. So to help myself out in the Bills franchise, I moved this cornerback Tremont Smith to safety. Likewise, I had moved, where's he at? I moved Jabril Peppers down to linebacker because he's a very good linebacker in the game if used properly. I've certainly moved around a ton of offensive linemen, as you guys might see. Lyle Collins had played a couple different positions for me. Obviously, where's he at? Cody Ford starts out as a right tackle. I moved him to left guard to better suit my play style. Connor Williams starts out as a guard. I moved him to tackle to suit my play style. And there are a ton of different position changes that you can do that are realistic, kind of within the realm of the game. And I want to talk about some of those position changes, some of the requirements at different positions. I know that this is a topic that I've covered before in different videos, but what I want to do is just cover those things and help out some of the newer players to the game. So let's jump into some of these position changes, and I've already mentioned a couple of them. So I think the best way to do it is just to go through position by position and kind of discuss a couple of these things. So the first thing that I want to discuss, and I actually want to look at my own roster here, is quarterbacks. There are, and this will help you guys out to know, there are some players in the game, and there will be players in the game in the future that are at different positions that are capable of playing quarterback. Now, I don't have a good example for you today, but there are players like, who am I thinking of? Why am I drawing a blank on his name all of a sudden? He's the wide receiver that's from the Pittsburgh area. Terrell Pryor, that's the name I'm thinking of. Terrell Pryor came into the league as a quarterback, but he now plays wide receiver. He might sign with a team. He might kind of be done with his career at this point, but there are plenty of players like that, like Terrell Pryor, that you will find at wide receiver, but might have quarterback stats that could get switched to quarterback. There's nothing unrealistic about taking a player that has played quarterback in college or in the NFL and moving them back to quarterback. You might get an advantage from that, because let's say you're a team that just doesn't have a very good quarterback option. Maybe you don't want to trade for one. Maybe you don't have a high draft pick to be able to acquire one. Something that you can do to take a player and move them to the quarterback position and help yourself out is get a player like that, like a Terrell Pryor, and move them to quarterback for you, because then they can be a dual threat. You can get yards on the ground. You can kind of have a dynamic offense by doing so. What I would say is if you're trying to move a player to quarterback from another position, it has to be somebody that has had experience at that position. You don't want to go to your halfbacks and just take Logan Steele or Roland Barton and switch them to quarterback, because that's not going to make sense. They're not going to have the throwing stats to be able to do it. They're going to be a one-trick pony. I don't recommend doing that. I only recommend finding some of the guys that have played quarterback, and there are quite a few of them out there in the NFL that actually have passing stats in this game that you could switch to quarterback. I think Mohamed Sanu is one of them. There are multiple different guys that could be options for you. Now, let's talk about halfbacks. Halfback is a position where you could move pretty much anybody to this position realistically and be able to utilize them. You could move a fullback to that position. You could potentially move a wide receiver to that position. There is history in the NFL of teams doing that with players. If you have a quarterback that is a type of guy that is kind of like a running threat, like a Tim Tebow type of guy, that is possible that you could move them there. There is actually a guy in our league that is like that, and his name is Levedian Shipamo. If you guys look at him, he's got 88 speed, 90 acceleration, he's got 83 strength, and he has, if I'm not incorrect, he's got really good carrying stats, like 88 carrying, 82 elusiveness, 82 ball carrier vision, all these different things. There's nothing unrealistic about taking a guy like that and switching him to halfback, because there's precedence for that in the NFL. Now, this is going to be a very rare case that you could take a guy like that and move them to halfback. Generally speaking, you're not going to really take many players and move them to halfback, because it's not going to benefit you. It's not really going to benefit you to take a wide receiver and move them to halfback, because if they're good at halfback, they were probably good at wide receiver. So that won't happen very often, but there are special cases where that does happen in the NFL. You look at Tavon Austin, he's a guy that got moved from receiver to halfback to be able to be utilized out of the backfield more often. It is not totally unrealistic to take a player and move them to halfback if you don't have player options at that position. The next position to talk about is fullback. This is one that I see people have issues with because there just simply are not a lot of good fullbacks in the game. If you go to the roster, there's maybe a handful of players that are in the 80s, let alone superstar players. There's just the one, who's Kyle Juszczyk, and a couple star players below that, and then they kind of fall off after that. Well, how do you utilize that position better, and how do you make the most of that? How can you get a better fullback even though there aren't good fullbacks in the game? Well, this is something that people look over all the time. There are a lot of good halfbacks that you can take and move to the fullback position. I could go out on the free agent market right now and find a whole bunch of guys that are probably useful at the fullback position. And why is that? Fullbacks are pretty much used in short yardage situations, and so if you're looking for a guy that is kind of a wrecking ball and that you need to get a yard or two, go into the free agency market, go to halfbacks, and find a power back. Simply search by a guy that has the highest trucking, take that type of guy, and you can move them to fullback, and they'll be able to get you a yard or two by trucking. There aren't a whole lot of good ones here in free agency right now, but some guys that I can think of off the top of my head are guys like Samaje Perine, maybe LeGarrette Blount, I'm drawing a blank on the name, the old halfback, Frank Gore from the Bills. You can take guys like that and move them to fullback and use them as short yardage players just to get yourself a yard or two. Now, similarly at the fullback position, if you're struggling to get a fullback that can block for you, that might be because you're not looking at the right position. The best thing that you can do to find a fullback to block for you is go to the tight end position, because there are so many more tight ends to choose from. You can find a tight end that is capable of blocking. Heck, you can even find a tight end that is both capable of blocking and receiving, and play them or move them to the fullback position, which is realistic because it happens all the time. A lot of teams don't even carry a true fullback, so they just have tight ends play the fullback position. Like, I don't know if you guys know who Ryan Hewitt is. He is a tight end for for the Cincinnati Bengals. I believe he's a free agent now, but he's a guy that was a tight end, but he played fullback whenever they had a set that had a fullback because he was able to block, he was able to receive, and he was able to do all those different things that he needed to do out of the fullback position. So I highly recommend that if you need a fullback, you also look at the tight end position because you'll be able to find guys that could block for you. I could take a guy like Keith Hackett here, who's maybe not the best tight end because he's only got 70 speed, doesn't have great catching or anything like that, but I'm sure he has really good run blocking stats into the 70s or something like this, and I could take him and move him to fullback, and he would be a really, really good fullback for me. So that is something that you definitely want to keep in mind, is if you're struggling to find a good fullback, because like I said, there aren't very many in the game, it is realistic to take a halfback or a tight end and move them to the fullback position to be able to utilize them that way. In terms of wide receivers, there isn't a ton of wiggle room here, but there are some players that you can transition to and from a wide receiver depending on certain circumstances. The first one that I want to talk about is you could take a halfback and transition them to wide receiver. That has happened. I'm trying to think of the guy's name from the Packers. There was a guy for the Packers, Ty Montgomery, is that his name? Ty Montgomery played halfback and wide receiver at times. You can take a halfback if they're a really good receiving back and move them to wide receiver. Now, they're not going to be as good, but let's say you have a situation like I have here, where I have a really good running back as my number one running back, and I really don't have any good wide receivers to lean on. I don't have anybody with any speed. I don't have anybody that's all that good at catching or anything like that. What I could do is I could take Roland Barden here, who is a very good receiving back as an 83 overall receiving back. He's got very good receiving back ratings. He's got good speed. He's got good catching. Everything that you would want out of a good wide receiver, I could take this player and legitimately move him to wide receiver, because right now I'm only using him as a wide receiver. I'm using him as a third down pass catcher. He's going out on routes. There's no difference between him doing that and him playing wide receiver. So if you have a player like that, don't be afraid to move them to wide receiver, because that is realistic. There's no problem with that. In addition to that, a lot of times you can take some of the speedier tight ends in the league and you can take them and move them to wide receiver. Now, this probably isn't going to be beneficial to you because it's very rare that you find a tight end that has enough speed to play wide receiver, but let's say you were the Giants and somehow you managed to acquire another tight end that's really good and you don't have good receivers. What you could do is you could take a guy like Evan Ingram and play him at wide receiver. There's no problem with that because he's really not that big of a tight end. He's 6'3", 240, which is just kind of a big wide receiver size. You could maybe compare him to a guy like Mike Evans or something like that. And he's got the speed and the physical tools to actually play wide receiver. There's nothing that anybody could question about that. However, vice versa is questionable. You don't want to take wide receivers and move them to the tight end position. This is something that I see a lot of people that are new to the game trying to do to get themselves a competitive advantage. However, if you're in a league that is promoting realistic position changes, you're going to get called out and you might get kicked out of the league or punished for trying to move a wide receiver to tight end. And that's because it just simply doesn't happen very often, because wide receivers, their frames, their size, their height and their weight simply is not comparable to a tight end most of the time. You won't be able to take most wide receivers and transition them over to a tight end. Now, like I said, there are some players that do have the size and the capability to play tight end. I still don't recommend taking them and moving them to tight end because there is very little history of any wide receivers in the NFL switching over to the tight end position and playing there, because the tight end position requires blocking skills. And most wide receivers coming out of college or in the NFL do not have the blocking skills necessary to play tight end. So even though Mike Evans is a type of guy that has the size and probably the ability to be a nice receiving threat as a tight end, he simply would not have the skills to play tight end that are necessary. And so it's unrealistic to really change anybody to a tight end. If you had a really good fullback, you could certainly change your fullback to a tight end position. Let's say you're starting off a franchise with the 49ers and you don't really know how to get a guy like Kyle Juszczyk involved in the game. Take him and move him to tight end, or at least play him as a tight end, because then you'll be able to get the ball in his hands more. He's a really good player and you're going to want to feed him the ball. So I highly recommend that you take guys at the fullback position and utilize them as tight ends, because there's nothing wrong with that. They're pretty much interchangeable positions, the fullback and the tight end position are. Now, let's talk about the offensive line. There is some debate on this. If you want to get really realistic with it, some players won't change positions across the offensive line in the NFL. That is true. Once a player has been in the league for quite a few years, they're usually locked into a certain position, especially if they're a top offensive lineman. So certain players like that, I would say you're going to want to keep them at their designated position. A guy like a Brandon Scherf, you wouldn't want to move him from position to position, although he might be flexible in real life. Generally speaking, players like this are going to stay at their positions. A guy like a Trent Williams, the left tackle, he would probably be sticking at left tackle for the rest of his career. Laramie Tunsil, same type of thing, older players like that. However, when you get younger players into the league, whenever you get young players on your team, generally speaking, I don't frown upon switching players from one offensive line position to another. But the important thing to note here is realizing what stats matter at each position. And I've addressed this in the past, but I'm going to cover it really quickly here for you guys today. So, at center, pretty much the only thing that matters is run blocking and strength. This is a person that's going to be going up against big, tough defensive tackles. Those D tackles don't have the speed to get to the quarterback 9 times out of 10, probably 19 times out of 20, to be honest with you. There are very few D tackles in the game that have the speed to get to the quarterback, and so you generally don't have to worry about pass blocking stats with your center, but you do have to worry about the strength to be able to go up against the big mammoths that they're going to have to block in the run game, and you have to worry about their run blocking stats. In addition to that, your center doesn't need to be very athletic. They don't need to have good speed. They don't need to have good agility or anything like that. However, when you get to the guard positions, the left guard position and the right guard position are interchangeable. These are guys that you're going to want to have slightly better athleticism on. You're going to want to have 70 plus speed, acceleration, and agility to be ideal as a guard. Now, obviously, not every player is going to have that. I have a guard starting here that has 65, 83, and 69. You want to try and get as close to those 70s as possible or better, because these guys aren't lined up generally against another player on the other side. And what does that mean? That means that they're going to have to move to get to somebody that they're going to have to block. They're going to have to pull. They're going to have to run a couple steps to get to somebody that they have to block. And in order for them to do that successfully, they have to be a little bit more athletic. So you can kind of ignore some of the the strength categories and some of the blocking, some of the blocking numbers for these guys. Generally speaking, you're going to want to focus, I'm messing up. I need to slow down. You're going to want to focus on run blocking stats for these guys. Pass blocking wise, generally speaking, nobody's going to be going up against them in the pass rushing game. It's the tackles that you have to worry about and slightly the center that you have to worry about, because there is automatically somebody lined up against them. However, with the guards, generally speaking, these guys are going to be facing maybe a blitzing linebacker from occasion. Maybe they're going to be doing a double team on another player, and so you don't have to be worrying about the pass blocking with them quite as much. Mainly, you want them to be athletic players that can, kind of get onto blocks a couple yards downfield from where they're starting at. Now, in terms of the tackles, the right tackle and the left tackle I consider to be pretty much interchangeable. The old school school of thought, I don't know if I said that right, is that the left tackle is the pass blocker and the right tackle is a run blocker. That's not necessarily the case anymore, especially with the way Madden plays. You want good pass blockers at the right tackle and left tackle spot. That is the single most important stat for these guys, is to have good pass blocking stats. Now, what I will say, having good strength helps, because you're going to be going up against premier pass rushers at the left tackle and right tackle position. In addition to that, being athletic helps in some ways, because they can go up against those guys that are really athletic a little bit better, but the athletic stats don't matter quite as much as they do for guards. What I will say is that your offensive line, the center needs to be the least athletic. The tackles need to be a moderate level of athleticism. Somewhere in the mid-60s on their athletic stats is probably the minimum. Your left guard, your right guard, they need to be athletic, period. That's the way it stands. In terms of strength matters for the centers, strength matters for the left tackle and the right tackle primarily. That's pretty much the breakdown on what matters the most for these positions. So when you consider switching a player around from position to position, make sure that you consider those things. Like if I were to consider Jarrett Kaiser for a position switch, I would likely switch him to a guard position because he is super athletic. athletic. If I were to consider, Greg Little for a position, he's perfect for center because he's got 90 strength. That's what you want at that position. If I were to consider Trey Hubbard for a position switch, he might be ideal for a tackle spot because he's not super athletic. He's not really fit for the center spot. He's really not fit for the guard spot. So I think he would be best fit at a tackle position. And so that's what you want to evaluate in terms of switching those positions. Then we move on to the defensive line, and this is where things can get, really interchangeable, I would say, is the word that I'll use for this. And I do this quite a bit. So your D tackles, for the most part, these guys aren't going to switch positions. From occasion, you can switch these guys to a defensive end spot. If they're a slightly more athletic defensive tackle, you can certainly move them to a defensive end spot. So if you look at Raekwon Davis or Taj Cooks, they're both pretty athletic. They have decent speed numbers for a defensive lineman, good strength numbers. There's nothing wrong with moving a guy like this to a defensive end spot. They're also not super huge. They're not like 350 pounds or something like that, but there are quite a few defensive tackles in the league that simply would not play a defensive end position. If you look at, let me see. Some of the top guys here actually would be able to switch positions. Chris Jones, Buckner, they'd certainly be able to switch positions. Epineza could. But if you look at a guy like Vita Vea, Vita Vea is a type of guy that is going to play D tackle, and he's not going to play defensive end pretty much ever in his career. And the reason being is that he's just huge. He's 347 pounds. He's 6'4", and he's only got 70 speed. So he's built to be a run-stuffing D tackle. A guy like Eddie Goldman is a good example. He's only got 64 speed, not very athletic. That type of guy is going to stay at D tackle. If you have a guy that's more athletic, which is kind of the way the league is going, if you have guys that have, high 70s speed or better, guys like Jacques Blackburn, AJ Epineza, Eric Armstead, maybe even DeForest Buckner, those are the type of players that could go over and play defensive end well and play it without it being unrealistic. Now, in terms of defensive ends, if you wanted a defensive end to play D tackle, you're going to have to take a guy that has good strength and good size to move them to D tackle. As you noticed with all these D tackles, all of these guys, pretty much all of them, are in the high 290s or the 300 plus pound range, and it's pretty consistent across the board here. So if you look at your DNs, there are quite a few DNs that are like Myles Garrett that are 262 pounds. They simply would not play defensive tackle because of their size. However, there are some guys like Ed Oliver, who I had as a D tackle and is now a DN, that are kind of interchangeable at both positions because they're on the edge of having the right size to be able to play D end or play D tackle. He has the right strength to play both, and so that's not a problem. You can certainly bump guys like Ed Oliver inside or outside, however it best fits your defense. Likewise with a guy like Aaron Donald, you can bump him inside or outside, and it's primarily dependent on their strength and their size and things like that. However, where you start to get questionable is whenever you start to decide, you want to run a 3-4 defense or something like that, and you want to move one of these defensive ends to the outside linebacker position. Well, there are specific requirements to move those guys to the outside linebacker position. Generally speaking, the defensive ends can switch to an outside linebacker position. But whenever you get a defensive end that is super heavy, a guy like a Quinnen Williams, even though he has the decent speed to maybe be able to play the outside linebacker position, you're looking at a guy that is just simply too big to play linebacker and probably should not realistically be switched to that linebacker spot. But what I will say is, for the most part, you will be able to switch 4-3 defensive ends to a 3-4 outside linebacker spot without too much trouble. The one thing that you'll get in trouble with is, though, that all of these defensive ends don't have good zone coverage, and you'll notice that with pretty much every single one of these guys. It's 48, 32, 29, 37, 50, 29, 41, 55. That's where you're going to get in trouble. So if you're going to expect your defensive end to switch to linebacker, if you're going to expect that linebacker spot to have any coverage responsibility whatsoever, do not move these defensive ends to that position, because a pass rushing defensive end by nature does not have coverage responsibilities and will not be capable of taking on that responsibility. So only move defensive ends to outside linebacker if their main responsibility is going to be pass rushing. And essentially what I'm saying here is, don't take a 4-3 defensive end and move them to a 4-3 outside linebacker spot, because that is primarily what a 4-3 outside linebacker's responsibility is. You're not going to be blitzing 4-3 outside linebackers all that often. And so that is when it would become unrealistic to take a player and move them to that position. Aaron Donald would never be a 4-3 outside linebacker, though in a realistic world, I could see Aaron Donald, if he went to a team that played a 3-4, playing as a stand-up outside linebacker pass rusher, kind of like a TJ Watt or a Bud Dupree, because he has that skill set. So keep that in mind when you're trying to switch those players around. Then we get to the linebackers. We'll talk about the outside linebackers first. So outside linebackers have the capability of bumping inside to middle linebacker or bumping down to defensive end. What I will generally say is that guys like TJ Watt are probably capable of doing either, because if you're talking about a 3-4 outside linebacker or even a 4-3 outside linebacker, they have the capabilities to at least move into the inside spot because they have coverage responsibilities, and they have oftentimes other responsibilities as well in terms of pursuing the runner, making tackles and shutting down plays like that. However, what I will say is that you will only ever really want to take 3-4 outside linebackers and switch them to a 4-3 defensive end, or any defensive end in general, because if you try to take a 4-3 outside linebacker and move them to a defensive end, they're going to get eaten up. And so I guess we could take a look at a guy like Micah Parsons here, who does not have good pass rushing abilities. He doesn't have good power moves or good finesse moves, though he is a really high overall outside linebacker. If you took him and moved him to defensive end, he would probably get eaten up because he would never get off his blocks, really. I mean, he's got decent block shedding and decent strength, so he might get off his blocks, but realistically speaking, he's undersized for a defensive end, and in addition to that, he doesn't have the pass rushing abilities to play defensive end. And so I wouldn't take a guy like this and move him to defensive end. I would consider keeping this guy within the outside linebacker realm and the middle linebacker realm, depending on what my defense is running, because this is mainly a coverage and pursuit type of player. If they do have the pass rushing skills, that is when you can take a guy like a Montez Sweat or a Khalil Mack or a TJ Watt and play them as a defensive end. And you guys will notice this in Madden from year to year, depending on which scheme a guy like Khalil Mack is in, he might be listed as a left outside linebacker or he might be listed as a left end. If you look at the Cardinals, oftentimes Chandler Jones is his name. Sometimes he's listed as a defensive end, sometimes he's listed as a linebacker, and that's because pass rushers like that can be interchangeable. The next thing I will say is middle linebackers pretty much have the reserve ability of being middle linebackers or outside linebackers. They essentially can be any middle linebacker, or they can be a 4-3 outside linebacker, because these guys aren't going to have good pass rushing skills, they're not going to have good power move, they're not going to have good finesse move, and you can't put them into a position where they have pass rushing responsibilities. These guys are reserved as pursuit and coverage guys only, and what I will say is with the way that the game is going today, you could probably get away with realistically moving a guy that's like Devin Bush, Tremaine Edmonds, maybe Deion Jones. You might be able to realistically get away with moving them to safety, maybe a strong safety. I wouldn't really try that because that's not all that realistic. There's not much history of guys moving from linebacker to safety, but there is some history of safeties moving to linebacker. So generally speaking, you're kind of stuck with your middle linebackers. You can move them to outside linebackers. Their overall might go up slightly if you move them to outside linebacker. That's a trend that I've noticed. But beyond moving a middle linebacker to outside linebacker, there's not much more wiggle room within that. In terms of defensive backs, I already kind of mentioned that safeties can sometimes come down and play middle linebacker. What I will say is that the only time that you want to do that is with a guy that has tackling and hit power abilities. If you get a guy like a Derwin James that has really good hit power, really good tackling, I don't see any unrealistic issue with moving him to middle linebacker. That is something that could happen, especially as players begin to age at the strong safety position. They will come down into the box more and play as more of a quasi linebacker. It is not all that often that this will happen, but primarily it will happen with strong safeties. Will come down in and play linebacker. You guys have seen for the Steelers, they had they signed Wilcox to play I think it was a year or two ago, they signed him to play middle linebacker, and then just recently they had that other guy off the Rams that played middle linebacker that started as a safety. But generally speaking, that's kind of the rule of thumb there. You're generally not going to move safeties to linebacker. They're kind of going to stay where they're at because of their speed. If you take a guy like a Minkah Fitzpatrick, even though he has good tackling ability and decent hit power, if you took a guy like that and moved him to linebacker, that would probably be considered unrealistic or cheesing because of the fact that he's got such good speed. It would make the game a little bit broken, so I would stay away from doing something like that. However, one of the things that will help you guys out is moving guys between corner and safety. Pretty much corner, free safety, and strong safety are all interchangeable if you're doing it correctly. So like I had mentioned with the Bills, I had taken Tremont Smith and moved him to safety, free safety, because free safety is a coverage type of safety. I didn't expect much tackling to be happening with Tremont Smith. I didn't expect him to be hitting anybody hard, and so I moved him to free safety because he kind of fits that role. But if you do have a corner that has good tackling and good hit power, like maybe a Marvin Perkins, he kind of has good on both, he might be able to get away with playing strong safety because of that natural role of the strong safety to be more of the tackler, the box type of player. However, the one thing that you will want to consider with these things is that there isn't really that strong safety, free safety difference anymore. A lot of teams kind of play both safeties as the same type of player. What you also see here is that I moved Teron Johnson to safety, so he was a corner at one point in time, and now he's playing safety, and so you can see he doesn't have very good hit power. So you can get away with helping yourself out by moving players to safety, and that was my dilemma with the Bills was, I had gotten rid of a couple of my older safeties. I didn't really have anybody to play safety, and I had like 5 or 6 young corners that I knew I wanted to start, so I was like, okay, it makes sense for me to take, Tremont Smith and play him at safety, and take Teron Johnson and play him at safety and get them as much playing time as possible. Now, what I will say is it's not the most realistic thing in the world, but more often than probably any other position, you will see corners switching to safety, and you will see safeties switching to corners depending on what the what the defense and the team is demanding of those players. I don't know if you guys know the cornerback Mills for Philadelphia. He actually switched over now where he is playing safety for them, I believe. And I think I might have him on my Panthers team here, so I can give you his full name. I don't know why I'm forgetting his name. Jalen Mills. So Jalen Mills came out of college as a corner, played a couple years as a corner, and now he's playing safety for the Eagles in their backfield, or whatever team he's on. He's playing safety now. So like I said, it's not all that uncommon to have players switch between safety and corner. Troy Apke you might see on my team, and you saw him probably on my Hidden Gem Safeties video. Super fast player. This is the type of player that you want to take as a safety and move him to corner, because you get that added advantage of that speed that can be really utilized as a corner. And that could help you out quite a bit. So that is how you guys can help yourselves out with your position changes in Madden. That is how you can get an advantage by knowing the realistic movements between positions, because you can take advantage of things like that. You can move players around whenever you have excess. Like, let's say you have a couple good middle linebackers. Like, I have a few linebackers here that I would like to use. You can take those guys and move them to other positions. So, Carl Joseph, I bumped down to middle linebacker because I was able to acquire Jamal Adams, and doing that allowed me to bump out Joel here to left outside linebacker, where he's actually going to play better as a left outside linebacker. So knowing those position requirements and knowing how you can utilize those things can help you guys out in a big way in order to manage your rosters better. So like I said, this is kind of directed at some of the newer players that don't necessarily know all these things about the game. I highly recommend that you kind of get experience with the requirements at each position so that you can change people around as needed, because there will be many times in this game where you'll have excesses at one position that could help you at another position. Like I said, I don't have very many good wide receivers in this franchise, and if I really wanted to help myself out, I could take Roland Barden and switch him to wide receiver, and that could help me out by taking an excess at one position and relocating him to another position. So hopefully this video helps you guys out in some way. Leave a like on the video if it did. Comment down below with what you guys would like to see next. I'll see you guys in the next video. Subscribe to the channel if you're new. Hope you guys have a great night. See ya.